All right, so the very, very important part here, right? We're creating the attractor point. The attractor point is basically going to be something that you've seen before, but I don't know that we used it this way. It's the command or sorry, the component that's called closest point, and it's under vector, I think, point, closest point. So closest point is going to ask you for a couple of things. It's going to ask you for, this is under vector point, let me put that in. It's going to ask you for the point to search from. That's important to read this one. And then the cloud of points to search. Okay, what it's going to give you is, well, don't worry about that one very much. So this will find what the actual closest point is. That's more of a two-dimensional sort of exercise, I think. But the most important one here for us right now is distance. And that's pretty clever because it'll measure and give you a list of the distance of every single one of the elements of geometry or points that you fed from a particular location, which then you can use as a scale factor to change that element's size. So you understand the relationship now? Some of you? Well, let's take a look at it. So closest point is going to find a point to search from, and then it will find a cloud of points to search. So the part that is a little bit confusing about this is that the singular point is actually the one that you want to put your cloud of points in. At least that's kind of the way it's described. So this will go into P, and that will need to be flattened, I think. It's just easier if you flatten it. Okay, so that list is going to come through as just a list of points. And then we can drop in a point in Rhino and then reference it in. So I'm just going to put a point somewhere on my grid, and then I'm going to reference it in using params right here. Say set one point. I'll put it right there and plug it in. All right, so I'm going to drop in a panel so I can read what these distances are. So this is telling me, based on the location of every single one of those points, which is the center point for those rectangles, it's reading the distance to that point. Okay, so here's the really significant block of information that you need to be aware of, is that we can take a list that has different values, and we can remap it to be a smaller domain. Okay, so these domains are like, we're using domain a lot, right? They're really powerful. So I can basically say, for every single one of these values, I'm going to take its minimum and its maximum, right? Say it's 5 and 45, right? And I'm going to say, take all of those numbers and wherever all the ones are in between and reduce it so that they all read from 0.25 to 1. So your 5 is going to be equated to a value of 0.25, and your 45 is going to be equated to a value of 1. Okay, it looks like this. Go under the Set tab, under the Math domain, and go to this one. It's called Remap Numbers. This is going to require from you the values to remap. That's your distances, so we can just plug that in right now. And then it will also require a source domain. The source domain is basically saying, well, what are my original minimum and maximum values? And so to get that from this list, we can go back into domain, and we can grab this one that's called bounds. And bounds will say, well, what's the lowest number that you're giving me, and what's the highest number that you're giving me? So we drop that in. We'll plug this in, and so it's saying our lowest number is a 1.03. our largest number is a 50.49, and we plug that into S. Okay, I'll get rid of this now. And so the T is asking you for, well, what is the range or the target domain that you want me to remap this to? So I can right click and set the domain manually like this, but I like to try and put things up on screen so you can really see it. So I'm going to construct this domain, and I'm going to tell it from 0.25 to 1. So now my panel here, when I plug in the remapped number value, now all of those numbers are reading between 0.25 and 1. And they're proportional to the original list. Okay, let me drop that real quick. And so essentially, let me get rid of this factor as well. So essentially at this point, I should be able to just plug in the remapped number values into the scale factor, assuming the geometry is actually already scaled to a value of 1, right? So right now it's showing me a half because the value is originally set to 1. So when I plug this in, what did I do wrong? Oh, I think I need to flatten this. Flatten. There we go. Yeah, sorry. So when I plug this in and you go back to the point value and flatten it, so we had a difference there in the groups. But when you go back to the point value and flatten it, now what you see, I'm going to turn everything off in front. But now what you see, the squares or rectangles that are closest to the point are the smallest number. And that's because the distance to the point is the smallest number. You guys feel it? You feeling it? Okay, so let me just walk you through an instance between two different ones, right? So let's say the distance from this point, from the point of this rectangle, I should say, to that attractor point is, 0.15. And the distance to this rectangle center point is 50. Those are my smallest and my largest values. And if I take those two values, just those two, and I say I want to change my lowest value of 0.15 and my highest value of 50 to scale down to a range of 0.25 and 1, then all it does is take those two numbers and crunches it proportionally into that frame or boundary or domain.
Why do you want to do that?
So that we can get a scale factor. Right? So a scale factor is a multiplier. So if I have a rectangle that is, one panel, wide, right? So it's a full-size rectangle. That's what we were getting all the way back here, right? So this rectangle right there is, call it 1 unit wide.
The outer or the inner?
The outer one. This is the original one, as if we don't have this. Okay, the rectangle that the dot sits in, or the point sits in, is the center point is 0.15 units away, right? It's the smallest one, it's the closest to the point. But it is right now sized at a value of 1, or even 10. Let's call it 10, okay? So if I can remap the distances of all of these points based on how far they are from the point into a framework that is no more than a value of 1, then I can just take that whole list of numbers and plug it into the scale factor, which is a multiplication. So that 0.15 distance that I translated into a 0.25 scale factor means that that rectangle that the dot sits in, or that square that the dot sits in, is going to be scaled down to 0.25 of its original size.
Okay. But between quarter and full size.
So everything in between gets scaled down proportionally. So let's say this one right here is 0.20 away, right, instead of 0.15. Then that's going to get scaled down to be just slightly larger than 0.25. It might even be like 0.26, depending on how many points are being measured and what the minimum and maximum values are. Does that make sense?
I'm not understanding what the purpose of this is. Could you apply this to like making a pattern?
Yes, well that's what we just did. So essentially we took this definition and we applied, and you should actually be very interested in this because attractor points directly relate to sun angles in operable facades, and I know that you're really into that. So if I place the sun, let's say this is like a round structure, and I have the sun on on the eastern side of my building in the morning, then I need a facade that looks something like that, right? And you can measure how much how much fenestration you actually have. Midday, it's going to be kind of toward the top of my building, so it should adapt to look something like that, right? Because it's a really high, steep sun angle. Or actually, vice versa, it should be more like that, right? And then you take the sun angle to the other position in your building, and you read it from your western sun, and it should look like that.
It's interesting. I guess I'm still not getting it, but continue.
Yeah, no, they're good questions. We're doing more analysis right now than anything else. So I'll explain it this way, that one of the best ways that you can use something like this is when you have a facade configuration that you're trying to analyze how much fenestration you really have. So I could take the area of all of these rectangles versus the overall area of the, let's say these are like shading panels. I could measure the area of all of them and then the area of the overall window system and see how much light is filtering into my space. Right, and then I can calculate my heat loads and stuff like that.
Okay.
So, but that's like way down the line. Right now we're just looking at patterning and logic and sequencing and how to understand the flow of information. But we'll get into some cool analysis stuff in a few minutes. Are there any other questions?